Let me see. Well, hello and welcome to another lecture in the Abralim ao Vivo series. Abralim ao Vivo is an initiative of the Brazilian Linguistics Association. Sorry for that. Now I think it's going to be better. We had some echo, so I think we're not going to have it anymore. Well, this is the first conference broadcast by Abralim's new board, but it was organized and scheduled by colleagues from the previous board, whom I thank for the initiative of preparing this series, which has become so important for the dissemination of research in linguistics. I am Adelaide Silva, and today I'd like to introduce Dr. Nikolaus Himmelmann. Dr. Nikolaus Himmelmann is professor in general linguistics at the Universität zu Köln. His core concern is understanding linguistic diversity and its social and cognitive underpinnings. A current major research focus is on prosody and the syntax-prosody interface. He has long-standing fieldwork commitments in insular Southeast Asia. At present, he closely collaborates with the Center for Engendered Languages Documentation in Manokwari, West Papua, Indonesia, attempting to document as much as possible of the dazzling linguistic diversity still found in West New Guinea today. So, Dr. Himmelmann, thank you very much for your being here today, and please feel free to start your talk whenever you want.
Let me see. Can we?
Oh, sorry.
I can't see me.
Oh,
yes,
now
that's the screen we had. Yeah, thank you very much for having me in this wonderful series. It's a really important series, as you said, and all the world is really participating, and I'm very proud and grateful that you have invited me to speak also in this series. My talk today has the title Universities of Language 3.0, and I will start with explaining very briefly the title and then go on to the main topics. So let me see, unfortunately, I cannot move. Here we go. So the basic goal of the talk is to convince you that we need to recognize a level of universal linguistic structure, which I call Universals of Language 3.0, which is directly derivative of the biological and cognitive infrastructure for communication. And in order to explain the title, let me just briefly mention that we, of course, know linguistic universals under a number of different names and frameworks, and what I would call universals of language 1.0. The first modern type is the one that was proposed by Greenberg in the 1960s, where you have this kind of universals which say all languages have the property X, or if the language property X if the language A has the property X, then it will also have the property Y, etc. They are all well known. I don't have to elaborate on that. Universals of language 2.0 are also very well known. These are the Chomsky type of universals, where you basically assume that there is a genetically determined language faculty, which in particular constrains the possible grammars of human languages. So universals of 3.0 differ from these two types of universals that are well known in the following regards. Most importantly, they are directly, or at least more directly, falsifiable than previous types, the previous mentioned types of universals, as the falsification is less dependent on analytical constructs, which is the crucial problem with many of the universals proposals that are around. And they are often manifest in a hybrid mixed form, mixing universal and language-specific features. As you will better understand what exactly this means in a short while. Before I actually start with the full exposition, let me just mention the fact that in some ways this presentation is also a reaction on the famous paper by Evans and Levinson, The Myth of Language Universals, Language Diversity and Its Importance for Cognitive Sciences, dating back to 2009, which has basically put into question both universals of language 1.0 and 2.0, criticizing both the Greenbergian and the Chomskyan camp and questioning whether there are any universals of that type. And while I'm very sympathetic with many of the points made by Evans and Levinson, a point of the paper is to say that there are some things about language or about linguistic structure specifically that stand a good chance of being universal, despite the criticism, the just criticism they are leveling against the earlier proposals for language universals. Okay, what are we going to do? I'm first going to explain a little bit what I mean with the notion of biological and cognitive infrastructure for communication, also known as the human interaction machine. I will then provide two extended examples for universals of language 3.0, namely the intonation unit on the one hand, and the agent-first bias or agent-first principle in morphosyntax, and then we'll conclude with mentioning brief other candidates of what could be possible universals of language 3.0. So to begin with, the basic framework, which I consider as a suitable starting point, is the human interaction engine as sketched by Steve Levinson in almost 20 years ago in a number of different publications, the core of which is the turn-taking system, which has a number of miraculous or very highly remarkable properties. The most remarkable one is the timing course of turn-taking, where people take turns all over the world in any language that is known to us in a very, very short time of something like 200 milliseconds or even shorter, which kind of presupposes that the speaker who takes the next turn has to start planning long before the current speaker is ending and has to be able to predict when the current speaker is ending. So we have to have the capability of both comprehending ongoing speech and at the same time planning our own speech, which we start in the turn we are taking over. This is a riddle in many ways, and much of the research being done by Levinson and his colleagues is trying to show how this kind of remarkable skill is actually working. Here is just a brief pointer to an important paper in this regard, where Levinson and his group was basically investigating a number of very different languages and showing that the time course of turn taking is pretty much the same all over the world, with some kind of variations, such as the fact that the Danish, in the Danish corpus, turn taking was a bit slower than in most other corpora, but this is really in a range which is not really questioning the fact that turn taking is taking place at a very rapid speed all across the world. There are other ingredients and other components of Levenson's interaction machine, interaction engine, which includes intention recognition, something he calls also the Schelling mirror worlds. There are adjacency pairs, that is question-answer sequences. There are repair systems and various other components which are claimed to be universal. But importantly, and that is important in the current context, they are, strictly speaking, not really universals of language, and Levenson actually makes that very clear, but they are rather universals of communication or universals of interaction, human interaction, and in no way specific to language, and not actually making any claims that specific linguistic structures are also universal. So if one accepts this basic proposal, the question arises whether this interaction engine constrains linguistic structures, and if so, how it does so. And in this regard, there has been not too much research, actually. There's one paper I'm aware of by Roberts and Levenson, where they try to kind of derive word order preferences from the pressures imposed by turn taking, which is not really very convincing, I would say, but I don't want to elaborate very much on that, but rather briefly mention the most convincing example, which I know of an attempt to link the interaction engine to concrete linguistic features and structures. And this happens to be a work of by myself on the on prosodic breaks and affixing preferences in the languages of the world. And the basic observation here is that we can find prosodic breaks, pausing, often also intonational breaks, pitch-based intonational breaks, in between a function word and the word it relates to, the content word it relates to, for example, between an article and the following noun, as you can see that in the first example here, and that's the end of the story, where you have a small break between function word and noun, and similar things happen in other languages like Japanese, where you have this case marking clitics or markers such as no, in the example ano, asoko no, etc. They were there at Katotoi Bridge, where again we have a break after the function word. Now, the interesting thing is that the position of the break, of course, differs when you look at pre-post versus post-post function words. Namely, as you can see in the first example, if the break occurs after a pre-post function word, then it separates the function word from its content word. But if it is a post-post function word and the break comes after, then the content word and the function word still form a prosodic unit. That's the basic observation. And the question is, why do we pause or have these breaks at all, and why do we have them exactly at those places where they occur? The one reason why these function words have breaks following them is that psycholinguistic research has very nicely shown that in sentence planning, all the grammatical items are planned way before they are actually called up for production. So function words are ready to go once the clause structure planning has been finished. So one can produce a function word whenever one hits on it in delivering or incrementally producing an utterance. And the question why one would want to produce it at a point in time when one is actually not yet ready with the following content word may have something to do with the turn taking, namely the premature production of a function word that is maybe due to maybe considered a floor holding strategy. And here we have the link to the human interaction strategy, the human interaction engine. And the upshot of the overall argument in this paper I'm quoting for is that you can relate these observations then to the fact that we have this very strong preference for suffixes in the languages of the world as compared to prefixes, which basically I claim in that paper is due to the fact that post-postgrams tend to be affixes more often than pre-post ones because they follow their content word and are not so often separated from it as pre-post ones, because the breaks relating to function words always come after the function word, regardless of whether it is pre-post or post-post. So much in terms of introduction, and now actually coming to the main part of today's presentation, namely the two examples for Universals of Language 3.0. And the first example is something which I claim is a universal segmentation unit. All languages make use of these units, namely, I think strong candidates for this status are intonation units, the phonological word, which I have with a question mark because there's a lot of evidence still missing, and also the syllable. I'm only talking about the intonation unit today, but I'm happy to take questions on the other levels as well. An important point in the argument is to make a very clear distinction between a phonetic definition of the intonation unit and a phonological one. And the basic claim is that phonetic intonation units are universals, while phonological ones are language specific and have very specific language specific properties, and in this sense are clearly not universal. I'm starting with a brief example just to illustrate what I'm talking about. And what I'm talking about is something like you see his hand sometimes at close-up, snatching the pears from the tree, and you hear the sound really strongly. Yeah, where you basically have units which are united on the one hand by having a coherent melody and some kind of boundary marking, in the sense that they are rising at the end in the first two lines and falling at the end of the third line. Prototypical intonation units also being followed by pauses, as in this example. The proposed universally applicable definition of intonation units makes use of three different types of evidence. There is rhythmic evidence, namely the interruption of rhythmic delivery by pausing, by lengthening of the unit final syllables, and by the rapid delivery of initial syllables of a new unit. So rhythm may indicate an intonation unit boundary. There is most importantly actually the melodic evidence that we have coherent pitch contours which are interrupted by a reset of pitch level. You either jump up or low or lower from the level you end in the 1 unit. So the reset of pitch, basically, or the reset of pitch level, is a very important indication of an intonation unit boundary, also in the absence of rhythmic evidence. And actually, if you were to do experimental investigations with tools such as EMA, etc., then you could also diagnose intonation unit boundaries by prosodic strengthening at the beginning of a prosodic domain, which includes intonation units boundaries. This very clearly differs. This definition differs from a more phonological definition of intonation units, which basically assumes a number of different types of tonal targets, here represented by T. So in the well-known autosegmental metrical framework, one makes a distinction between metrically anchored tones, which are also known as post-lexical pitch accents, and edge tones, which consist inter alia of boundary tones, which kind of mark the beginning and the end of these intonation units. But as you will remember, there is no reference to these types of units in this phonetic definition, simply because the question of whether all languages have boundary tones in the same sense, or whether they have post-lexical pitch accents, is not clear. Or actually, in the case of post-lexical pitch accents, there is good evidence that not all languages have that. So these aspects of intonation units tend to be language specific and not universal. But the boundaries phonetically defined are universal, and that is the claim I'm defending here, or which I also have investigated with my working group. There is a number of different types of evidence for the claim that the phonetically defined intonation unit is universal. And one very interesting type of evidence for this is that you can, in machine learning, people have shown that you can train a boundary classifier, so a classifier which kind of inserts intonation unit boundaries in a running text in a recording on the basis of acoustic evidence. If you train such a classifier on one language, English for example, then you can take this classifier and run it on another language, Chinese for example. In this sense, these are very different, obviously very different languages, as Chinese makes use of pitch for tonal distinctions, as you all will know. So they are very different languages, but still, if you train a boundary classifier on a corpus from one language, you can get similarly high results in identifying intonation units in the other language, which basically shows that somehow the same kind of acoustic evidence can be found across very diverse languages. We have checked this also with human annotators, so human classifiers, you could say, by making an extended experiment in unit identification across familiar and unfamiliar languages, published in this paper here. As you can see, this is we used a fairly substantial corpus of more than 3 hours of narrative of recordings of spoken narratives, altogether more than 20,000 words, 27,000 words, so that in this overall corpus there were more than 27,000 intonation unit boundaries to be identified. And importantly, the recordings come from a number of very different languages. On the one hand, we had a set of specimens from German, and for other purposes not discussed here, also from two other Germanic varieties, namely the local language from Cologne and English. Then we had Papuan Malay, which is a contact language, a trade language in the eastern part of Indonesia. And we had a number of local languages, small minority languages spoken in eastern Indonesia. Woi, Waima'a, and Yali, the first two Austronesian, the third one Papuan. So quite a mixed set of languages with very different intonational systems. We gave these data to 4 students and asked them to indicate where they hear intonation unit boundaries. And the students, of course, would know the Germanic languages, but they wouldn't have any clue about the other languages included in this sample. And if it were the case that intonation unit boundaries were totally language specific, then one would predict that these 4 boundary raters or boundary annotators, all of them native speakers of German, would not be able to agree on boundaries in the non-Germanic group. Yeah, but if there are universally identifiable boundary cues along the lines of the definition for the phonetic intonation unit, which I showed you before, then one would predict that they can also agree on the boundaries of intonation units, even in languages they don't understand. And that is exactly what we found, that there was a surprisingly high inter-rater agreement across the whole corpus. And in fact, actually, regardless of whether the language was very well known or not known at all or unfamiliar to the students, as you can see here in this numbers for inter-rater agreement, standard measures for standard inter-rater agreement, especially the so-called Fleiss-Kappa measure, where you can see that actually the agreement between the German students who annotated the corpus was even a bit higher with regard to the Papuan languages Woi and Yali than for their native German. There are a number of reasons why this could be the case, which I'm not elaborating here right now, but the important point that I want to drive home here is obviously there seem to be cues to intonation units independent of languages that can be identified by people who are not familiar with a given language. And in this sense, we can say that intonation units, phonetically defined, are universals of language. Actually, there is further support for this idea from recent work by Israeli colleagues who actually used the data we also used in our experiment and found that the sequences of intonation units in our data form a consistent low frequency rhythm at the 1 Hertz range. And that this 1 Hertz, they predict actually that this rhythm at the 1 Hertz range can be linked to a brain oscillation rhythm that occurs at a similar Hertz range, namely the so-called delta oscillations. So if that were true, I mean, this is just a hypothesis, then one could actually say that the intonation unit is a unit which is directly linked to some neural activity, brain activity, and that is basically also the reason why intonation units are universal. This is just the basic unit, the intonation unit. One can then also ask the question whether one can actually also distinguish specific types of intonation units by similar kinds of experiments. For example, whether one can identify something like a parenthesis, which is often and across languages marked very similarly, or whether one can identify list intonation independently of knowing the specific system. If that were the case, then we would have not only the intonation unit per se as a universal, but we would also have specific types of intonation units. But this is something that could be considered to be universal. But this is something that clearly needs further research. As I said in the beginning, it is not the case that everything in prosody is universal, and I would also say that not everything in the prosodic hierarchy, the hierarchy of units that has been proposed for languages is universal. The intonation unit is, according to the evidence we have compiled here, clearly one. It is not so sure whether the foot, for example, is a universal unit of prosodic structure, and actually there is some evidence that it is not. Similarly, the intermediary between the prosodic word and the intonation unit, there may be different levels of prosodic phrasing, but it doesn't seem likely that this is also found in all languages, but where there is fairly good evidence for phonetic universality is the syllable topic. I'm not going into here today, but there is a very nice recent paper by Xu on the universality of the syllable, which makes a very clear and strong argument why this has to be universal in order to coordinate, to serve as a basic temporal coordination of articulations. Importantly, not going beyond the units, prosodic units, I should also stress the fact that not all types of prosodic events are cross-linguistically identifiable in the same way as I tried to illustrate this for the intonation unit just now. And one example would be prosodic prominence. Something which is heard to be stronger, louder, more prominent in some sense. We have done also some experiments, and there is a literature on so-called stress deafness, which clearly shows that speakers of different languages hear differences in prominence differently. So it is very likely that prosodic prominence is not universal in the same sense as the intonation unit, the phonetic intonation unit as I just presented it. Though I should emphasize that this is an open issue where the evidence that is available is far from clear in one or the other direction. Just briefly to mention, there is another approach to the question of universality in the area of prosody by Carlos Gussenhofen in particular and Zhu Chen, who have talked about 3 biological codes which get used in the languages of the world in different ways, and this in as much as the evidence for these 3 codes and their universal interpretations, which are listed here in the middle of the column. I'm sorry that this doesn't come out very well on my screen at least, but you can easily find it in the book von Jussenhofen. In as much as there are these universal interpretations of size differences, energy differences, and level differences in the pitch contours, then that would also be an example of the kind of universals which I'm interested in this presentation. So now we are basically through the first main part of the talk, and I take a very brief break, and if there is and there would be time to take a question or two at this point. Otherwise, I would go on in a minute or so, just to give you a little bit space to breathe and me the possibility to have a short sip of water. Okay. Then I go on to a completely different type of universal of language 3.0, namely the so-called agent first bias. I've chosen, of course, these examples to kind of give an indication of what kind of types of universals are to be expected under this label. The agent first bias is well known in a number of guises. One of them is the observation going back already to Greenberg and actually to older literature, where it has been noticed that in word order options in the languages of the world, it is much more common to have the agents placed before patients or non-agent arguments. In the Greenbergian framework, this is called subject and object. So the SO languages are much more frequent than OS languages, as you can see here from a recent version of the World Atlas of Language Structures. 1,148 languages SO and 40 languages OS. Importantly, you have to remind yourselves that while Greenberg and many word order typologists speak of subject and object, what it's actually meant are semantic units, agents and patients, or agents or actors and undergoers. So in the languages of the world, the much more prevalent ordering is agent before patient. There are a few exceptions, but still it's clear. I mean, this kind of statistics clearly supports the idea that there's a strong preference, a very strong preference, to place agent arguments before other arguments. The question is how one can explain this or how one can model this preference. And one very strong hypothesis in this regard is to say that the agent first bias is a universal processing bias, which is hardwired in the processing system. And if you take that really serious, as I've just stated it, that basically means that whenever speakers of any language produce utterances where there are agents and non-agents, then they should kind of experience, as it were, a pressure to either put an agent first in the row of arguments, or when they are comprehending, processing an utterance produced by another speaker, to interpret the first argument expression they encounter as an agent. Yeah, so as something The prediction is that this bias is constantly present in both speech production and speech comprehension, and regardless of what kind of grammatical system you are speaking. And there are obviously two challenges, two tasks for this hypothesis. One has to show, on the one hand, that there is real strong evidence for it. And the other major task, or the greater challenge actually, is that one has to have an account for the exceptions. Because, I mean, it is very clear already by the Walls data that not all utterances in all languages of the world at all times are agent first, right? I mean, there are languages where authors have claimed that the basic word order is under goer first. So how come these exceptions come about? And given that, according to the hypothesis, all speakers at all times should experience a pressure to have agents first. As for the evidence for the processing bias, there are two different types. The one is the more direct type, namely from online processing, basically from psycho and neurolinguistics experimentation. And the other one is more indirect, more classic linguistic evidence, namely either diachronic or synchronic, which are not so distinct, but in some ways can be considered to be essentially manifestations of the same kind of mechanisms. The diachronic development, the agent bias in diachronic development would say that we can see a lot of unmotivated, in the sense of not caused by some other change, not obviously caused by something else, changes from non-agent first to agent first, rather than the other way around. Yeah, that when we have changes in word order, most of the changes in word order we can trace in attested diachronic developments are from non-agent first to agent first. And in terms of synchronic variation, and that will be the focus of my presentation here, is that when we look at a language, if we can see if variation is allowed within a language with regard to the positioning of agent and non-agent arguments, then there will be a strong preference for the agent first ordering. Similar kind of variation, synchronic variation, one can often observe with regard to closely related languages, as I will illustrate in a minute. But before doing that, I will briefly point to a publication and a lot of more work than just this one publication done by Balthasar Bickel and Matthias and Ina Baunkessel-Schlesewski, who have spent quite some time in trying to present neurolinguistic evidence for the agent first bias. For example, with German data, as you have them illustrated here, we have two German sentences: that Bertram Surface congratulated has or have. Yes, so that Bertram is a name, has congratulated Service, where Bertram is the agent. And if you have a sentence like that Bertram Surface congratulated have, then the Surface are the agents and Bertram is the person who gets congratulated. And if you play sentences of this type to German subjects and look at their neural reactions, then you can see that when Bertram is, as in the first and red example, is the agent of the sentence, then there is no particular reaction when the auxiliary is uttered and when the auxiliary is uttered, this is the point in time where speakers have to or become aware of the fact that Bertram is the agent. But when you have the haben auxiliary at the very end, which makes it clear that Bertram is not the agent, but rather the undergoer of the congratulation, then you get a so-called N400, which is widely interpreted as pointing towards semantic incongruity. So speakers of German, obviously, as shown by this experiment, form the hypothesis that the first mentioned argument is an agent, as predicted by the agent first bias. And if it's not, then they have special reactions, brain reactions. And the interesting thing in the work carried out by Bickel and colleagues is that they have done similar experiments also in other languages, including Hindi and other ergative languages, and the reactions are the same. It's not the case that in an ergative language, speakers do not have this agent first kind of bias in interpreting utterances. Coming to the kind of evidence I and my colleagues here in Cologne have worked on, where we have looked at synchronic variation and kind of tried to show that actually in synchronic variation we find exactly what is predicted by the agent first bias, namely that variants, alternates that put agents first are much more common than the opposite kind of possibilities, namely to have an undergoer ordered before the agent. We discuss and illustrate this with a certain number of languages, with a certain group of language, which is quite special in a typological context, namely so-called symmetrical voice languages, of which Tagalog, the Philippine national language, is a major example, and which are very well known for their grammatical systems because they have caused a number of problems for widely attested notions such as, or widely used concepts such as subject and active-passive alternations. So these languages are characterized by the fact that for all transitive situations or states of affairs, they allow two different types of constructions, namely an actor voice construction, which you see in the example A here, Bumabasa nang diario ang teacher. The teacher is reading a newspaper, where Tagalog and the many other symmetrical voice languages are verb initial. You have an initial verb in actor voice, which is marked by Then you have the undergoer or the patient, nang diario, the newspaper, and then you have the reader, the agent, the teacher, ang teacher at the end. And then you have another construction, the undergoer voice construction, kinain, nang busa, ang daga, again starting with the verb. Kinain, marked with in as an undergoer voice verb. Then nang busa is the cat, which is the agent, and ang daga is the rat. The cat ate the rat is the undergoer. So in the undergoer voice, the verb order is verb, agent, patient, or actor, undergoer, and that is fully in line with the agent first hypothesis. But in the actor voice, the ordering is patient before agent, which is clearly contradicting the agent first hypothesis. Now, with regard to this predictions that the agent bias hypothesis, agent first bias hypothesis makes, is that what we find, actually this slide was basically just saying what I already, repeating what I already said. in principle, one can summarize this basic system attested in many symmetrical voice languages that we do not have very clear evidence for a prominent agent first slot in these languages, because in the basic constructions, they allow for transitive eventualities or states of affairs. You can either have the actor first or the undergoer first. But the agent first hypothesis makes the prediction that whenever we have variation with regard to these two patterns, with regard to this actor voice and the undergoer voice pattern, which I just illustrated, there will be a tendency for actors to be positioned before undergoers, and there will be no converse tendency for undergoers to be placed before actors. Yeah, that's a prediction regarding possible variation or a tested variation in a set of languages or within languages of this type. So for the actor voice, we predict that in addition to what is the standard basic word order where the undergoer comes before the actor, you also will have one where the actor comes before the undergoer. But for the undergoer voice, you will not find an alternate pattern where the patient comes before the agent. And unsurprisingly, probably after this introduction, this is what we actually find in symmetrical voice languages of the Philippine type, namely that there are languages such as Ibaloi, illustrated here with two examples, the man went to Kabayan, where the agent argument can be placed before the other argument, as in A, or it can follow the other argument as in B. So in Ibaloi, both orders, agent before patient or patient before agent, are allowed, but in undergoer voice, we do not have any kind of variation, but we strictly have the agent before patient ordering. And there are actually a few languages. We have looked at a sample of 50 languages altogether of this type in Philippines and parts of Indonesia. And there are some languages which actually have grammaticized the ordering of the agent first ordering in the agent voice, as illustrated here with an example from Tatana, a language spoken in Borneo. Mopoguli i Gaman do buk di amaino. Gaman is giving a book back to his uncle, where the agent argument i Gaman directly comes after the verb. So in this language, we basically have verb agent patient in the actor voice, and we have also verb agent patient in the undergoer voice. Thus, this language actually illustrating being now actually fully compliant with the agent first bias. So basically what we are claiming as a universal here in terms of variation is that whenever we find word order variation in transitive constructions, then the pool of alternative options will be strongly biased toward an agent first order. Yeah, and this bias can be manifest both within a given language and across genetically or areally closely related languages, that is in cross-linguistic microvariation. And what I just showed you for this for these Philippine type languages is exactly in line with this hypothesis. In the paper, we also have a more specific formulation of the hypothesis for symmetrical voice languages, which I just skip over here, and come to the important final point in the discussion of the agent first bias, namely to this question, of course, why is agent first not really universally attested in the sense that all utterances in all languages at all times are agent first? And the very fast and much too simplified answer is there are other biases which are in competition with the agent first bias. And one of these biases, which are a little bit better documented and better understood and are relevant in this regard is that languages also show a general speech act participants first bias, SAP first bias, either first or second or both before third person. Here you have another example from the pronominal clitics in the Philippine language, where you can see that in I saw them in A, kinita ko dan, and they saw me, kinita a dan. In B, the pronominal clitic for the first person is obligatorily placed before the clitic for the third person, regardless of whether the first person is an agent or a patient. Yeah. So, of course, many of you will be familiar with inverse languages, where the speech act participant hierarchy, the person hierarchy, plays a major role in ordering of arguments, with first or speech act participant expressions generally placed higher or earlier than the non-speech act participant. So there is a competing bias, and we have to assume that there are a number of such competing biases on word order, and the question is, of course, how to exactly model this, but in principle one can explain exceptions to the agent first bias by taking into account the fact that there are competing other biases which explain why the agent first bias does not always play out in full. If you want to be a bit more precise than what I said at the beginning, in the agent first bias basically means or predicts that in the thematic domain, or with regard to the semantic role of arguments, there is a clear bias to favor agents in first positions, and there is no undergoer first bias of any kind. Yeah, so that's actually the claim that is being made. The claim is not being made that there are not other biases influencing the word order which kind of can cancel the agent first bias. Okay, that brings me almost to the end of my presentation. I very briefly, just in order to be more complete in the illustration of what I mean by Universal of Language 3.0, I will give you a number of other examples which need further scrutiny. They are not worked out. This is more a hypothesis that they could be Universals 3.0, but would need much more work in order to make that clear. One is the well-known propositional discourse functions of predication, reference, and modification, which I suspect are very much universal in the same way as intonation units and the agent first bias, but I have no clue so far for how to actually show this in a similar empirical way as I try to do this for the intonation unit or the agent first bias. Of course, there are indexicals and perspective taking options, local dialectics, person reference now, and represented speech. But again, the question is, where is the experimental evidence? How can we link this to the infrastructure for communication, the Levinson's interaction engine? Yeah, that's the challenge that I pose before something can be considered a Universal 3.0. Information structure stands a good chance of being universal, but again, one needs more experimentation and evidence that this is actually the case. There's also something completely different in a very different domain where Douglas Biber makes the claim that one can actually universally distinguish registers or speaking styles on the basis of corpus analysis. So by basically running different algorithms across very diverse corpora from different kinds of languages, and they claim is that the algorithms will lead to clusterings on the one hand, identifying something which can be called narrative discourse, and on the other hand, to allow a distinction between a more involved or oral kind of discourse and a more informational or literate kind of discourse, where importantly, this is not a difference in terms of modality. Yeah? So it's not about speaking and writing, but it's about the basic register styles, which he characterizes as more oral or literate, or it's probably better to talk about involved versus informational. Okay, let me summarize in a few words. What I have been proposing is that we have to, or we can recognize a level of linguistic structure which is directly derivative of the biological and cognitive infrastructure for communication. And this level of linguistic structure is much more specific, much more linguistic in a certain way, less definitional than the Hocketian designs features, for example. The structural level is hybrid in that units and principles belonging to this level typically combine language-specific and universal characteristics. And inasmuch as they are truly universal, it should be possible to investigate them experimentally across languages and speaker populations. Yeah, this is my main point, which I hope to have illustrated well enough with the intonation unit example and the agent first bias example, that we actually can provide different kinds of evidence, especially also non-linguistic evidence, for these types of units in experimentation. As an aside, as it were, I just want to note that universals of language 3.0 are not comparative concepts, because they are to be falsifiable empirically, and they are part of the biomechanical infrastructure for language and not simply definitional kind of concepts to serve language comparison. And finally, the overlap between the universal structure and language-specific categories is due to the fact that language-specific categories and constructions are further grammatizations of the universal categories. Yeah, so in the case of the intonation unit, we have the universal phonetic intonation unit defined by the criteria I gave on the one slide for rhythm and melodic criteria, which is to be distinguished from a phonological intonation unit, which is language specific and clearly not universal in terms of showing the same structure in all languages of the world. And language-specific categories and constructions are also constantly exposed to universal processing biases, but of course, as language-specific categories, they are not universal. So, I have now the 2 or 3 final slides, which I'm not going to go through anymore, just for the people who want to look at this again. There is a list of the universals of language I have mentioned, or including the candidates for this status. This is, or going back here, that we have universals of prosodic structure. We have hardwired processing biases, where the speech act participant first bias still needs experimental evidence. And we have other candidates such as interjections, indexicals, universals, registers, etc., where in all cases we need more evidence to really be sure that they are universals of the type intended here. And very finally, just pointing to recent work in the area of musicology, where in terms of the basic framework, the basic thinking and the basic methodology, namely that you kind of identify features of music and distinguish between culture-specific and universal features, and actually show that the universal features are automatically, in part, algorithmically identifiable across a big sample of musical specimens from different cultures of the world. I mentioned this recent paper by Mayer and others, which exactly show this, namely that music does appear to be tied to specific perceptual, cognitive, and affective faculties, and that actually all systems, musical systems, have certain traits in common, which can be shown in various types of experiments. Thank you very much. This is the end of this presentation. Thanks for coming and listening, and thanks again for inviting me to this wonderful lecture series.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so I thank you also, Professor Himmelmann, for your great talk. And we now will start the discussion session with the invited discussant, Dr. Rainer Peroso from the Department of Modern Languages at the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul. Dr. Peroso is a member of the Laboratory of Bilingualism and Cognition at his university, as well as the Phonetics and Phonology Applied to Foreign Languages and the Speech Science Laboratory. He develops research in the field of psycholinguistics, focusing on the perception of non-native speech. He has a background in English language teaching, and his research interests include phonology, cognition, and the philosophy of perception. So, Dr. Peroso, thank you for accepting our invitation. And I would also ask the audience to post any comments or questions for Dr. Himmelmann. So please, Rainer, up to you.
Yeah, thank you, Adelaide. Thanks a lot for your words. Professor Himmelmann, thank you very much for your speech. I think it was very enlightening from many points of view, especially for people who are interested in universality. I think it's very, very interesting. Actually, I have 3 questions for you, and I'm going to start from actually the last one, taking into account that you mentioned a recent study that tries to engage musicality and also universality to a certain extent. So taking this evidence into account that languages could use words and a type of control in order to use it in their songs and communicate universality somehow, my question to you is, if we think outside from linguistics, considering, for example, the whole bunch of studies in cultural anthropology or even in pragmatics, do you think these 2 fields could contribute somehow to our descriptions in terms of linguistic universality?
Yes, clearly so. I mean, this is not, I should really emphasize the fact that the musicology is not my domain, but I really found this paper very interesting because of these parallels in argumentation in principle. But of course, yes, pragmatics in the broad sense would encompass what I was calling the basic infrastructure for communication, quoting it from Levinson. So basically, what Levinson does is to kind of show that the kind of topics and principles and generalizations we find in pragmatics probably have a basis in human cognition and human sociality, and I think this is very clearly an important background for all kind of linguistic work, and should inform linguistic work. The important point I was trying to make is there is it's a big step from talking about interaction, politeness, presuppositions, and implicatures, especially Gricean principle kind of things, to actually trying to explain concrete linguistic structure. Yeah, so I didn't talk about this because that's not really directly part of the human interaction engine, but Steve Levinson, of course, has worked a lot on binding principles and has tried to show how one can explain them from a Gricean perspective rather than assuming that there is some kind of grammatical structure which is innate for this type of phenomena. That's exactly what I think is needed, that we can relate this anthropological, general cognitive, interactional kind of findings to the concrete linguistic forms and kind of show what aspects of a linguistic phenomenon may be related or based on this universal cognitive social kind of trait of humans and what is language specific. And as I tried to say, the most language forms actually mix both aspects, and we have to kind of find out which one is the universal one and which one is the language specific one.
Okay, thank you very much. My second question is much more grammar based. You briefly mentioned something about the clitics in your speech, and going back to the beginning of your talk, I'd like to know if you could have some information related to clitics being a reasonable evidence for thinking about categories to establish any type of intonational units.
Not sure that I fully understood your question. Can you?
Sure.
Can
Yeah,
you
sure. Yeah. Do you think clitics could be a reasonable category for establishing somehow intonational units?
Yeah. They play a. They are very. How should I say? They actually are the main problem in defining intonational units. Yeah. So rather than saying that clitics are of a big help in identifying intonation units, I would rather say they probably are they can be major troublemakers because they often have a specific kind of characteristics. For example, I have struggled quite a number of times in quite a number of different languages with the phenomenon that you have a good evidence for the end of an intonation unit, but then you still have an element following. And it's kind of added on, and these are typically or very often clitic type of elements. And they have their own behavior. So one could think about the question of how far one can generalize about the point that clitics have special behaviors with regard to intonation, yeah, which is already part a bit of their definition. But then, of course, I should emphasize the fact, and that has been this point has been made a number of times in the last 2 decades. The notion of clitic itself is a very complex and controversial one, and it's not clear, or actually many people would say it's unlikely that all the phenomena that get the label clitic attached share something. Yeah, so there's the famous second position clitics. There is short forms of when you can reduce is not to isn't, cannot to can't, etc. and various other types of clitics, case clitics coming at the end of a phrase, but still having a certain prosodic independence and other things. So I think I would be hesitant to say that to talk about clitics is a good start in talking about intonation units and intonation unit boundaries.
Okay, thank you. And the last one is a question that actually has to do more with morphology. As you were talking about, for example, that study that compared Chinese and another language regarding those boundaries, I'd like to know if the structure of the language, either it's an analytic language or a synthetic language, do you think that could be playing a role in establishing or defining some criteria for intonational boundaries or intonational units?
Yes, that will be. I mean, this is exactly the point. There will be like if you have Chinese and if you use pitch for lexical distinctions, yeah. So you have syllable. Chinese is a syllable tone language. So the main thing that pitch is doing is to convey lexical meanings, yeah, to convey different word meanings. If you have a language like that, then you can basically predict that whatever you still can do with pitch in terms of marking boundaries, that will be very different from what you can do in English and German with pitch for marking boundaries, because in German and English, pitch is not yet occupied, as it were, for conveying lexical distinctions, yeah, but rather can be used more freely for among other things, for marking boundaries. But the basic claim is, and you were referring to this example with Chinese and English, and that was basically from machine learning. The claim is there are properties in the acoustic signal in English and in Chinese which are picked up by machine learning algorithms in such a way that it makes sense to use the classifier trained, or which learned on Chinese data what an intonation unit is, to use this classifier and run English data with it and get very good results. So the algorithm obviously identifies elements in the acoustic stream that is universally recognizable for intonation unit boundaries. Otherwise, the result couldn't be the same. Yeah, and so I mean, Chinese was the big outlier. They basically had European languages in their sample, if I remember correctly. Yeah, so it was Italian and English and French or something. But still, and of course, one would like to see more experiments along these lines. But in principle, I find it very intriguing that you can use really automatic processes to identify intonation units across languages.
Okay, Professor Himmelmann, thank you very much. As pessoas que estão na audiência, se tiverem perguntas, podem colocar no chat. We're going to ask those questions to Professor Himmelmann as long as you post them.
I would like to pose a question. May I?
Yes, please.
Okay. Going back to the features that can be recognized by machines in the acoustic signals, so that we can propose them to be universals. Would that be the case of fundamental frequency, probably, but also voice quality? I mean, are there some cues from voice quality that can be learned by machines so that they can be took as universals in establishing the boundaries for intonational units?
I'm also not a specialist in machine learning, I have to clearly say, but from what I understand, it is one of the problems of all these machine learning things, which is very successful, is that we don't really know why they work. They just, I mean, the outcome is clear. They are successful. They do classifying of intonation unit boundaries, and if you compare that to human classifiers, they agree with it, and so they seem to work. And what kind of acoustic phenomena exactly they are actually making use of in delivering their results is not clear. Yeah, but it is of course very likely that the kinds of things which I have listed as defining the intonation unit phonetically, and in as much as they are identifiable in the acoustic signal, that they play a role. So I mean, it's pretty obvious and very, very likely that pauses will play a major role, and that is, I mean, that is well known for that concerns human annotators and the machines. It's the pause plays a major role. So when we have a big pause and a few additional indications, then we basically say it's an intonation unit boundary. The complications come in that we also know that there are hesitation pauses and that they have a different profile. But it's also clear that, and some people have worked on that pauses, hesitation pauses, for one thing, often having being filled, but also in the acoustics have special characteristics, so they can be distinguished. And when the algorithm can do that, then of course the unit boundary pause is identifiable, and then gives a good input for doing this classification of boundaries. Yeah, so we don't know which exactly the phenomena they use. It's likely that they use pause, probably also pitch, probably also speech rhythm and similar things.
Okay, thank you.
Professor Himmelmann, we have a question. I'm going to read it for you. It's from Martin. It says, the universality of intonational units seems different from the universality of agent first bias in that the first is more abstract when not talking about specific intonational structures and definite, whereas the agent first bias is more concrete but probabilistic. Is that correct? Looking for other such universals, in which corner should one look?
That's an intriguing question. Thank you very much. I'm not quite convinced that I would phrase this in terms of being more abstract and more concrete. What is clear to me is that we are talking about two very different things. On the one hand, the intonation unit is a unit, is a segmentation unit, and the agent first bias is a principle or is a principle or a bias which is active in processing. And I think on that level, they are kind of not really comparable or commensurable. And it is a challenge for the overall approach that I'm advocating here, that we basically call both of this universals 3.0. Clearly, and there I agree, the agent first bias is more probabilistic and more strongly undergoing or prone to interact with other things and have interactions with other principles. That's an important difference to the universality of intonation units. But I think the basic difference is, let's to express it overly simplified, is a difference between having a unit, especially a segmentation unit, and a processing principle, or a structure. You can also say a structural principle. And then that, of course, looking for other such universals which corner one should look at is, of course, then the question. There are many units in linguistics, and one can start thinking about which ones stand a good chance of being universal. Then there are quite a number of structure building principles, iconicity, for example, that are important for building more complex structures. And that would be the other type one would be looking for. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I thank Dr. Himmelmann as well as Dr. Rainer Peroso for being here with us today, participating in this Abralim ao vivo. And I also thank the audience for the presence, and I hope to see you soon in another Abralim ao vivo. Our next conference will be next Wednesday, so hope to see you soon. Good afternoon, good evening. I thank you, Professor. Thank you, Heidi. Good night. Bye-bye.